While Israel is prepared to make generous compromises for peace, it cannot go back to the 1967 lines, because these lines are indefensible.
So are their allies at odds? As Israel's Prime Minister once again rejects the U.S. President's vision of a peace deal, President Obama reasserts U.S. commitment to Israel's security. This is Inside Story. And welcome to a special edition of Inside Story from Washington, D.C. I'm Shihab Rutansi. Israel's Prime Minister sat next to the U.S. President on Friday in the Oval Office and for the second time in 24 hours flatly rejected Barack Obama's endorsement of a peace deal with the Palestinians based on 1967 borders. President Obama, on the other hand, made no mention of that vision. Instead, he reiterated that while differences remain between the U.S. and Israel, in the end, the two countries are close allies, committed to bringing in a, quote, new period of peace and prosperity in the Middle East.
Our ultimate goal has to be a secure Israeli state, a Jewish state, living side by side in peace and security with a contiguous, functioning, and effective Palestinian state. Obviously, there are some differences between us in the precise formulations and language, and that's going to happen between friends.
The Palestinians will have to accept some basic realities. The first is that while Israel is prepared to make generous compromises for peace, it cannot go back to the 1967 lines, because these lines are indefensible.
Al Jazeera's Rosalind Jordan looks back now at the last 2.5 years of U.S. policies towards the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Yet another attempt to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A seventh visit to the White House by the Israeli Prime Minister in a so far fruitless attempt to end the occupation and pave the way for an independent Palestinian state. When he came to power, President Obama said the Israeli-Arab conflict would be a priority for his administration. He appointed the former Senator George Mitchell as his special envoy and sent the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to Israel in March 2009, only a month after taking office. The president first set out his blueprint for relations with the Arab world and his broad policy on the Middle East conflict in what was billed as a major policy speech in Cairo in June 2009.
So let there be no doubt, the situation for the Palestinian people is intolerable, and America will not turn our backs on the legitimate Palestinian aspiration for dignity, opportunity, and a state of their own.
In September 2010, the White House launched its most ambitious Middle East peace initiative to get the stalled peace process back on track by hosting direct, face-to-face talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians in Washington.
These face-to-face talks are critical for both sides as they work to build trust and confidence.
But negotiations broke down later that September when Israel refused to extend a partial moratorium on the construction of settlements. Another setback to the peace process took place in January 2011. That's when Israel announced the construction of 1,400 more homes in occupied East Jerusalem. The United States did nothing. Then, 1 week ago, the White House announced the resignation of Special Envoy George Mitchell, further evidence of a peace process that has gone nowhere. On Thursday, in an attempt to clarify his vision, Obama endorsed the pre-1967 borders as the basis for future peace negotiations.
We believe the borders of Israel and Palestine should be based on the 1967 lines with mutually agreed swaps.
A message rejected outright by the Israeli Prime Minister as he met President Obama in the Oval Office. Rosalind Jordan for Inside Story.
So are we witnessing just more talk, or will President Obama's speech and his meeting with Israel's Prime Minister amount to a real change in course for whatever peace process is in existence? To discuss this further, we're joined here in Washington by Edward Walker. He's a former ambassador to Israel, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates. From Newton, Massachusetts, by Ehud Iran. He served as a foreign policy advisor to the former Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Barak. And from Los Angeles, we're joined by Palestinian scholar and author Sari Makdisi. Ambassador, if I could begin with you, are those who are wondering why President Obama allowed himself to be lectured to by the Israeli Prime Minister, simply being oversensitive, not understanding the intricate strategy currently at play?
Well, I don't think that he was being lectured to. He was obviously putting his position forward. But President Obama is polite. He's going to listen to what the Prime Minister of Israel has to say. He doesn't have to agree with it. And as I think you could have seen from the body language of both gentlemen, there had been a certain amount of tension in the air, and they were not on the warmest of friends at that point, although our countries are definitely friendly. So, you know, it's just another element of the problems that we face, is that some of the principal actors, whether it's on the Palestinian side or the Israeli side or the American side, have very little trust of one another.
Professor Magdisi, what did you glean from this Oval Office appearance?
Oh, I mean, I think it's the usual thing with the Israelis telling the U.S. what the red lines are, what it can and cannot do, what it can and cannot say, that it's detached from reality and so forth. What I think is especially interesting, though, is that both Israel and the U.S. are completely detached from the new reality in the Arab world, which is that it's not for the American president or the Israeli prime minister or anybody else to dictate to the Palestinian people or any other Arab people what their fate, what their future is. The Arab people, including the Palestinian people, are taking their own fate into their own hands, and that's a new reality that the U.S. has got to learn to acknowledge very quickly, and Obama's speech gave not even one hint that he's actually come around to that point of view, to that new reality.
Ehud Iran, how can we explain Prime Minister Netanyahu's confidence? We were told beforehand to expect confrontation, given the enormous upheaval in the Middle East right now, which would perhaps, theoretically, perhaps make him have some pause for thought.
Well, I think there's at least two levels to that. One is immediate coalitional constraints. Prime Minister Netanyahu leads a right-wing coalition, which has a fraction of it that generally wants to keep control over the West Bank for ideological reasons. And some of the confrontation, in my view, is done for internal reasons. Secondly, it seems to me that there's a suspicion in the Prime Minister's environment that the American view of looking at the events in the region is another episode of Rosa Parks, or a American-type march towards democracy, may seem different or does not exactly follow the same script in the region. And there's a concern in Israel that viewing it only from this a purely liberal perspective may place Israel and even American interests under danger.
But in fact, actually, from the speech that President Obama made yesterday, Ambassador, it seemed the administration was being very careful to detach the Israeli-Palestinian issue and indeed the new phenomenon of these non-violent protests and so forth from the Arab uprising. President Obama wasn't talking about freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the inadmissibility of firing on unarmed protesters and so forth in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, was he?
No, actually, that's one of the characteristics of this speech, is that it was almost two speeches. One was dealing with the Arab Spring and how we're going to react to it, and I thought he was quite candid and forthcoming on the nature of our policy as we go forward. Then there was the Palestinian issue. It was not really linked by him. Maybe it should have been, but I didn't detect that he was linking the two issues.
In fact, Ehud Iran, I mean, that's another reason why, despite the furor over 67 borders, which frankly most people in the world thought wasn't really an issue, that was the basis of future negotiations, even through international law and everything else, it was rather a good speech for Israel. Everything was rather framed as Prime Minister Netanyahu might frame things.
No, so look, Israel is divided over these issues. So alongside the Prime Minister's critique, the Minister of Defense's party, Atzmaut, put out an announcement saying it was a fair and balanced speech. And obviously there are a lot of elements in it that I think most Israelis would agree on. So the tension is over certain elements, but other elements, as Professor Magdisi mentioned, do reflect the ongoing relationship between Israel and the United States, or the depth of the alliance, if you will.
Professor Magdisi, you've already perhaps suggested this, but if we're just going to have these arguments over 67 borders and the future of negotiations while there's all this upheaval in the region, what is the relevance of what's going on in Washington over the coming days?
Oh, not much. But I think, Shihab, your previous question really touched on it, which is to say, when Obama talks about self-determination and nonviolence and the freedom of assembly and this kind of thing in the Arab world, and then, as you point out, completely severs the question of Palestine from that larger context, of course, there's something fundamentally wrong about that. What Palestinians have been doing for 60-plus years is struggling for what people in Egypt, Syria, Tunis, and so forth have been struggling for. I mean, they've been struggling for a long time, but they've come around to it more clearly in the past few months. In other words, what people in Syria want is what people in Egypt want, is what people in Palestine want, which is self-determination above all and freedom from an oppressive, tyrannical regime. The regimes in all these cases have used various forms of repression to keep people under control. The Israelis, just like the Syrian state, just like the Egyptian state, just like Libya, just like Tunis, so forth, have been using various forms of violence and suppression. It's not going to work in the long run, I think. And my point is that the U.S. needs to choose. It can either go on supporting the repression of whole populations, or it can say, this is a new reality. We have to accommodate the fact that people have fundamental rights. And especially since America wants to claim to be the beacon of rights around the world, we should embrace those rights rather than siding with the people who are against them. And the speech is interesting because it precisely says the U.S. will not side with Arab dictatorships against their people, but it will side with Israel against the people that it's suppressing, which is an incredible contradiction, of course.
Ehud Iran, I mean, are these considerations changing Prime Minister Netanyahu's viewpoint on all this? Is it changing anything in the discussions, the sort of discussions that go on behind closed doors in the Oval Office, or is the case being made, look, this shows that you need us even more in the region?
Again, there are mixed responses in Israel. There are people even close to Netanyahu, like Nathan Sharansky, the head of the Jewish Agency, that welcomed the Arab Spring, saying that it's better for Israel, who sees itself as a democracy, it will be better for it if the region itself becomes democratic. At the same time, there are people that suggest that changes in regimes or political instability, and currently we have mostly political instability, are a reminder that any long-term arrangement or giving away territory in response to peace is unstable. So I think there's slight confusion on what is the specific response.
But there's no fear about becoming utterly irrelevant, actually having no control over events if these are simply the parameters of the discussion within Israel.
Well, as Professor Makdisi mentioned, there's a strange dichotomy in the region. We see for the last 6 months enormous energies in Arab countries outside of the Israel-Palestine context, whereas the Israel-Palestine context, which was the epicenter of conflict for so many decades, has been relatively, in a very strange way, stable. And the big question we're all asking ourselves is, when will these two energies, when will these two worlds touch each other? So we saw a bit of it last weekend on the Syrian-Lebanese border. In my view, the speech also reflected, simply by the mere fact that the Arab Spring and the Israel-Palestine issue were put in the same speech. And remains to be seen how this dynamic will work together.
Ambassador, it was said, though, that the speech displayed an utter lack of understanding, President Obama's speech, of how things have changed in the Arab world. And then, by extension, then, that dichotomy that the President's made between the Arab Spring and the Palestinians is part of that. And indeed, so is the President's utter dismissal of what the President called the delegitimization of Israel, what others call a global peaceful movement of resistance against occupation.
Well, I certainly don't agree with you or with the others. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but with others who say that this has showed no understanding of what's going on in the region. It showed far more understanding of the Arab Spring and so on. They may have been a bit late coming to the conclusions, but certainly he put himself and he put the United States on the side of those people who want to have freedoms now. Now, the problem that we're running into, and what the professor said, is that you can't negotiate with a diverse, dispersed, popular revolution. You have to have people to negotiate with, and you have to have representatives. And thus far, we don't have a clear idea of where those people are and who they are, so that you can actually sit down and have a serious negotiation. And the same thing applies on the Palestinian side. We are still struggling with the divisions within the Palestinian community. And while
they've just sorted out those divisions, and that's now being used as a reason not to negotiate.
You say they have sorted it out, but they haven't sorted out a policy that is consistent between them. Hamas still has the exact same policy as it had before, and that's what the president is suggesting, is that you cannot negotiate with somebody who's basically decided to destroy you.
Why do you think a decision was made to emphatically reject the what we expect to be the announcement of Palestinian statehood at the UN General Assembly in September by the White House?
Oh, this is a long-standing policy of the United States, and the reason is you cannot impose a solution. If the two sides can't come together, or the 15 sides, how many you want to count, can't come together on a solution, it's not going to be sustainable. There has to be agreement on by the contesting parties on what the ultimate situation will be, and it cannot be imposed by the Security Council or the General Assembly or the United States, for that matter. So unless we can have a legitimate negotiation where people can try to resolve their differences and stop all the posturing, then this situation will go on indefinitely.
Professor Makdisi, actually, there were many who are against the occupation who also were against, frankly, the declaration of statehood by the Palestinian Authority, because they felt it was just it would be rather symbolic and might actually even might be rather counterproductive. But having seen the rejection of the Americans, perhaps you might change your mind.
No, I mean, there's several things to be said about that. We could talk more about that if you want to. But the most important thing is to note how Obama talks about self-determination throughout the Arab world, and as the ambassador says, siding with those who want freedom and so forth, but not for Palestinians, and that's where he draws the line. So Palestinian aspirations are turned in President Obama's speech on their head. They're inversed. So they don't want freedom, they want to end Israel. They don't want rights, they want to negate Israel. They don't want self-determination, they want to delegitimize Israel and so forth. It's all inversions rather than acknowledging what it is that they're actually saying they want. And that just goes back to the same point, that there's a fundamental lack of willingness to engage. Going back to what the ambassador was saying about negotiations, there's a couple of things to be said about that too, which is the idea that the U.S. is claiming to look at a kind of situation from a neutral standpoint. We side with nobody. We're not backing anybody. We want the parties to come to an arrangement, and we're not going to involve ourselves in this. Is, of course, it's just simply ridiculous, because the U.S. does back one side over the other. I mean, you can't give a speech saying we want the parties to come to an arrangement, but on the other hand, we have unlimited support for one party. That's not neutrality, by any understanding of the term neutrality. So we have to overcome that. And it's, by the way, it's not just the American president, it's the American people, fundamentally, who have to put pressure on their government to say, we have a certain set of values as Americans, and our values above all prize self-determination, freedom of expression, those kinds of things, and equality above all. And we should align our foreign policy with those values. That's what he was saying in the wider Arab part of the speech. That is to say, he's embracing American values as projected onto the Arab world. But he's trying to exclude Palestine. And my point is, you can't go on making this false exclusion indefinitely. And the last thing I want to say is to go back to something that was said a few minutes ago also, is that the so-called Arab Spring is in contact with events in Palestine. I mean, the events last weekend, tens of thousands of Palestinians in the occupied territories, in Gaza, the West Bank, inside Israel, and on the borders, protesting and being shot at and killed by Israeli forces, reminds us of what's at stake and of the dynamic that's at stake between people who want freedom, like any other people wants freedom, and an oppressive state that denies them their fundamental rights. That's what this struggle is fundamentally all about. It's not just about the declaration of a state in the West Bank, which is what the statehood thing is all about.
Ambassador, and that's the suspicion, is that this administration doesn't get it.
Well, I respectfully disagree. I think the administration does get it. I think that one of the problems is the one I said before. You cannot have a position unless you come to an agreement on what that position is. And thus far, we have multiple positions on the Israeli side. The Minister of Defense has one position. The Prime Minister has another position. We hear two different stories coming out. The Palestinians have the Hamas story. They have the Fatah story, and God knows what else. People have got to sit down and decide what it is they really want. That's what the people did in the streets in Tahrir Square. They decided what they didn't want. But now they're faced with the problem of what do you put in its place?
Right, but we're just going through the Tahrir Square portion of this, and then at the very least America can agree on the right of free assembly, of free speech, and the right not to be shot at.
Absolutely.
But they haven't come out and said that.
Well, I thought that's what the president said.
Not in the Israeli-Palestinian context.
Well, maybe it's a question you should ask the president.
It's interesting, though, the reaction to the speech from American Republican frontrunners was fascinating. They took the 67 issue and ran with it. Do you think that's partly because of the fundamental misunderstanding about what actually the Middle East conflict's all about, and Mr. Netanyahu can come here and sort of stoke that lack of understanding or comprehension of 67 borders and UN Security Council resolutions and so on?
Well, I don't think that any one of those candidates had read the damn speech. They were completely off base when saying that the president had said that Israel has to go back to the 67 borders. That's not what he said at all. What he said is there's a basis for a negotiation and that there will be swaps of territory, which is what we've been saying for the last 8 years.
Right. But do you think that's actually, that sort of reaction is in President Obama's thoughts as he makes these speeches and he appears at the Oval Office and so forth?
Well, I think that he's thinking in terms of what the negotiating history has been and where we were before and how he can pick up on what the positives were in those other previous negotiations and start the process going again. This has been a problem for the Israelis. They didn't want to pick up where, indeed, they had left off before. So that's part of what we're arguing about. Where do you start?
Ehud, Iran, then, can you detect a strategy from Prime Minister Netanyahu in the coming week? He's got a lot ahead. He's got the AIPAC conference. He's got speaking to both houses of Congress and so forth. Is he just going to appeal to the extreme right wing and the Likud sort of side of AIPAC and so forth, or is there actually going to be anything constructive here?
First of all, his general approach, I think, and he gets a lot of flack from it back home, is that he's been reactive. Unlike other Israeli prime ministers, like Prime Minister Rabin, even Prime Minister Sharon, Netanyahu, by and large, was reacting rather than setting the agenda. So I think you should expect more of that. Secondly, he's trying a fine balance, the traditional Israeli balance, between a more hawkish coalition and a need to maintain the alliance with the United States. And somewhere in between this balance, we'll see him going, as we just heard in his press